Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
What do you mean, biblical?
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian, joined by Chad Gross. How you doing, Chad?
I'm doing well. I'm kind of excited. I realized on the way here today,
To the studio.
on the way to our vast studio, I realized that this interview is kind of the result of me getting COVID. Because when I had COVID, remember, I wanted to read a book. And I wanted to just read a book to read a book. I didn't want to read it to prepare for an interview or to study something. I just wanted to read a book. And there was this book on my shelf called Is Reality Secular by Mary Poplin. And I had been wanting to read it for years. And I think I got it in 2014, 2015, somewhere around there. And so I read it. And then, of course, as soon as I read it, I reached out to you and said, man, we have got to have this lady on the podcast.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so exciting to speak today with Mary Poplin. She has a PhD from the University of Texas. She's a professor of education at Claremont Graduate University in California, where she served as director of the teacher education program and deans of the School of Educational Studies. She conducts research inside urban classrooms and schools that promote both justice and accountability. She teaches courses on pedagogy, history, and philosophy of education, as well as Christian principles related to these areas. She is also a frequent speaker at Veritas forums and for both Protestant and Catholic retreats across the country. So our interview today is about her book, Is Reality Secular? Testing the Assumptions of Four Global Worldviews. So is reality secular? It offers basically a clear, compelling, and concise description of four basic worldviews. Mary discusses the application of the worldviews in light of current cultural events and issues, and she relates her own growth and movement between the worldviews. So a little bit of a worldview deep dive today. So we're excited to see what she has to say and how this relates to the Christian faith and looking at other worldviews.
When I read the book, I just really liked the way she framed her argument. As you mentioned there, she has this personal story that kind of weaves in and out of the different worldviews. But I also like it as it's kind of set up as if I could say this, an indirect abductive argument, right? This idea of like inference to the best explanation. She's talking about these phenomenon that everybody kind of experiences and everybody goes through. And essentially, implicitly, she argues by the end of the book that Judeo-Christianity kind of fits all of these together best, especially when compared to those other three. And so I found it to be a really engaging read. And I was really impressed with kind of the depth and the width of how much it was able to cover and show how all-encompassing the Christian worldview is. Yeah,
there are a lot of different worldview books out there, so to speak, and many of them could be categorized as just like summary and analysis of the various worldviews and over and against the Christian worldview. But this just takes a different approach, and her personal story is really interesting to follow as well. So
yeah, and Brian, one of the things I'm interested to ask her is I was recently listening to a debate between kind of internet atheist Aaron Ra and philosopher Randall Rouser on the question of Old Testament violence, which was kind of a strange debate because if you listen to it, it was on Modern Day Debate. They never really got to that topic, which was kind of strange. But as an aside, one of the things that Rouser talked about in the beginning of the debate was how when you come to the question of Old Testament violence, you have to consider, your worldview first. And I'd say they spent a good 7 to 8 minutes discussing worldview because Aaron Ra was adamant that he does not have a worldview and that Christians all the time are telling him that he has, in his words, that I have this thing. They're telling me I have this thing that I don't think I have. And so I'm very interested to hear kind of what she thinks about somebody who claims, that's kind of a Christian thing. I don't really have a worldview.
Yeah, well, we'll see what she says.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Mary Poplin, thanks for joining us for the podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Can you tell our listeners a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
All right. Well, I guess one of the things I should say, because it was my reason for really studying out Christianity and other worldviews, is that I was not a Christian for a very long time. And I had a radical conversion after I was a tenured professor. So that was a challenge. Well, first, I work with the poor. I work in the education of the poor and research in that area. And one of the first things I saw as a professor was, as a Christian, was a film of Mother Teresa. And I was very moved by it. And I thought, well, if I'm a Christian and I'm concerned with the poor, maybe if I go see her and try to do the work, I'll understand better what Christianity looks like in education. Well, that didn't exactly happen. But when I went to Mother Teresa's, I did sort of, I guess, more fully have my conversion. It just got a lot deeper. And I was there and I wrote a small book called Finding Calcutta, which was really kind of part travelogue in a way, but it was also to describe who Mother Teresa was to people like myself. And then after I did that and I came back, I found that it was very difficult. I had kind of an intellectual crisis. I would go in my office and I'd start to cry because I still couldn't understand how to integrate Christianity into my academic life, even though I knew by now that Christianity, if it was true, had to have something to do with everything, and including everything I was teaching. And so that's when I began to study worldviews, and I began to then write about them. And that's how that particular book came about. So that book is more academic. The Finding Calcutta book was just really almost a travelogue. You
mentioned there being in academia, and then the words you used were a radical conversion. How do you mean? And could you describe that a little bit more?
Well, I would go into my office and I would look at the things I was getting ready to teach, and I would see that there was nothing Christian in it. And I would begin to have small ideas that this had to do with something I knew that was Christian. And then I would just cry because I didn't know how to integrate the two. I didn't know how to present what I believed anymore. And so after that, I began to just study. I'd go everywhere where there was a conference, I'd go, whether it was Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox. I'd just go to all these places to try to understand what I was seeing and why I couldn't integrate it. And I remember speaking at a women's conference in education, and they wanted me at lunch just to describe my experience at Mother Teresa's, and I did. And at the very end of that, they asked questions, and a woman in the back, I still remember very clearly, stood up and said, well, what did you learn at Mother Teresa's that has to do with your work? And I just started to cry because I didn't know how to explain it. And that's when I began to really study worldviews and to look at what the differences were. I mean, there's nothing in any worldview. So let's say secular humanism, pantheism, that there's not some slight overlap with Christianity. And there's nothing in Christianity that comes against academic thought, but it's different. So for example, this is an example I use lately because people are very concerned about justice, and you hear justice all the time. But the word for justice actually which is mostly in the Old Testament, is Zadik. The original word is Zadik, T-Z-A-D-I-K. That word does not just mean justice, it means justice and righteousness. So one of the reasons that when we look at our Proverbs and things, justice and righteousness appear often together. Well, they do that because the word Zadik has both of those things in it. That's very different to look at justice, where you have to look at justice and righteousness together. So we've tried a lot of different things, from the 60s integration of schools to now what we're doing, which is more the sort of reversal, so that the people who have been in oppressed groups want to oppress people who have not been in those groups, right? So it's really just doing the reverse. But we've never really looked at these issues as a big whole and as something that God cares a lot about, but he has different strategies for it.
Interesting. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I was curious, before we kind of start digging into the worldviews you talk about in the book, what was your worldview like before you were a Christian? Can you unpack that a bit? I know from reading the book that that's multi-layered, right?
Yeah.
But just for listeners, so they kind of know where you're coming from.
I was very heavily involved in the pantheist movement. And other than that, I was basically a secular humanist. I never considered that humanism or anything I was studying had another side or a better explanation. That was the secular humanist piece. The pantheist piece was, I used to say I was a secular humanist by day and a pantheist by night. So I was just toying around with a bunch of pantheist things, which can be kind of dangerous.
Sure.
I got myself into some trouble. And then I had this radical dream. And the radical dream, when I woke up, I just knew I had to do something, that I was going the wrong way.
Do you want to talk about that dream, or is that a personal thing?
I was in a long line of people. We were all dressed in gray robes, kind of a pantheist look, right? And we were like suspended in a night sky, a dark night sky. And we were just marching. I knew I was in a line, and nobody seemed to be breaking line. And I didn't know how far back in the line I was. So I leaned out to my left, and it looked like the line just kind of snaked around and disappeared. And I thought, well, I must be at the back of the line. So I looked, and it was the same way. So we were all obviously kind of not marching exactly, but we were in step, and we were walking towards something. That's all I knew. And so I just kept walking, and all of a sudden we passed, this was all black and white. All my dreams except this one have always been black and white.
Wow.
And the part of the dream I was in was black and white, okay? But all of a sudden I saw a light coming out from my right, and it was like a yellow light. And I thought, wow. And as we got closer, it was like watching the Last Supper. So the disciples were at the table, just like the painting. They were all facing us, which I'm sure is not the way they ate it. But anyway, they were all facing us. But they weren't paying much attention to us. They were just talking to each other, and they were eating. And then all of a sudden I realized that this was the Last Supper, but Jesus was not at the table with them. And I looked up ahead, and I saw Jesus. And we were all passing by Jesus. So it was a reception line. And when I got to Jesus, I looked into his eyes, and I was just, captured by his eyes. I couldn't get my eyes off of his eyes. And when I looked at his eyes, I had the revelation of all the filth I had inside myself. I mean, it was so filthy and so horrible that I couldn't keep looking at him, and I fell down at his feet. And in the dream, the last thing that happened is he leaned over and touched my shoulders while I was down on the ground. And when he touched my shoulders, I felt perfect peace. And then I woke up, and I knew I had to do something. Then I knew I was going the wrong way. It was like one day you're one thing, and the next day you know that what you are is wrong.
Yeah, it's so powerful. I mean, it was power. You used it beautifully in the book as well.
Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. Transitioning to the book now, you take us through an analysis of major worldviews, talk about your journey and your own exploration and personal experiences. If someone says, well, what's the book about, Mary? How would you describe it briefly, and how would you describe your main motivation for writing it?
My main motivation was I began to see that other Christians were like me. They were pretty lost in terms of relating what they were doing and what was going on in the world to their life as a Christian. And it's still hard for me, because you live in a secular world, you're surrounded by it. And especially in the university, you're not really supposed to talk about Jesus. I mean, I've sort of gotten by with that. But for the most part, it's very difficult. And so most my colleagues who are Christian and also faculty members are very careful. They don't talk about Jesus either. The problem is that Christianity has, I believe, what I call a higher rationality. And so if you leave it out, all you've got are secular analyses of the world and secular solutions. So that's why I wanted to write a book where other people who work in any intellectual field could see that there are things in Christianity that give a higher rationality to something. So, like I mentioned with justice and righteousness, the same is true with gender. If you look at gender in the Bible, the same is true with all kinds of issues. And I believe Martin Luther King knew that. I mean, there's several really wonderful quotes that where he was trying to explain that this is not just the world as we think of it or as the rest of the world looks at it. And so I just felt like it needed to be there.
Yeah.
And I've been blessed by people who had written apologetic books, especially James Sire, who had written a lot of, I got to know him before he passed away. And learned a lot from him. And then I just began to try to see what exactly are the basic assumptions we're making, like secular humanist assumptions about all these things like psychology. What is it? Paul Vitz does some really great work on that too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just thought maybe I could put something together and it'd help somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it was definitely a blessing to us. I can say that for sure. So just to be clear, when we're talking about the title of the book, Is Reality Secular? What do you mean when you use the word secular? Can you unpack that a bit?
It's really the wrong title. And I had an argument with IVP about this, but because it's not just about secularism, because pantheism is also a problem, right?
Sure.
So is reality secular? It was just a way of saying that these secular ideas that we have, even when they look humanistic, they're not really Christian. So, a lot of humanism is not Christian. It's, it's more trying to be a good person kind of thing.
Sure.
And sometimes that is even worse than that because it's not just not trying to be a good person, but to try to kind of feel good about yourself being a good person. And it's not necessarily, there are a lot of times, just look at Jesus. Jesus did not say nice secular humanist things to us.
True.
If you really read what he said.
Jesus does not play around.
He doesn't play around.
Yeah.
So, and then I also saw the rise of what I was already into, which was pantheism, which is huge now because all the tech giants, for example, they're basically pantheist. So if you look at Zuckerberg and the Google guy and all those people, they are basically pantheist. And they're pantheist not in the way that Buddhism is pantheism. It is pantheist because there are real religions that are pantheistic. But what we do in America is we kind of make up our own feel-good thing. So when those tech giants, like Zuckerberg was like that too, when they talk about their spirituality, it's made up. It's pantheism, but it's made up pantheism.
One of the things we want to talk about later on is, and I think you call it this in the book, is kind of that Western pantheism, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's the part that kind of the title misses.
Sure.
They're not secular, although they may think they are. They may just, I don't know how they actually see it. But, I think Zuckerberg thinks he's got a religion.
Yeah. It is interesting how many, this is just a side note, but it is interesting how many speakers or authors that you hear say something along the lines of, the title of your book is, and they'll say something like, that's actually not what I called it. Or it's just very interesting.
It's true. You have to negotiate that with your publisher.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
We're dealing with worldviews all the time, but maybe not everybody's thinking in terms of worldviews. And so I'm wondering what you feel as from an apologetic standpoint or looking and evaluating truth claims from various religions and things. Why take a worldview approach to that sort of a thing?
I guess the worldview thing covers a bigger landscape. Kind of shows the seriousness and depth of both the overlap between Christianity and secularism and the distinguishing features. But most people, I think, I believe even myself, most of the time, I think I'm operating off secular humanism. I have to catch myself a lot and think, is this really true? Because there's just so many varieties of secular humanism.
Yeah, I love the way, one of the things that excited me about the book, and this kind of piggybacks off of what you said in the question, is how you framed it in that sense of, I had never thought of it before, of the four worldviews that you consider and how other worldviews may be subsets of that worldview. But essentially, those four worldviews kind of encompass all worldviews in one way or the other. And I thought that was something that I had never thought of. That was pretty cool. So I wanted to ask you, when we were thinking about worldviews, I actually was recently listening to a debate, and the Christian brought up this term right in the beginning of the debate about worldview. He said, you've got to address these questions. It's a worldview question. And the atheists, they spent about, 5 or 10 minutes in the dialogue talking about this non-believer basically was resisting the idea that he even had a worldview.
Right.
And he wasn't the first one I've heard do this. And some people even try to almost approach it as if this worldview idea is a Christian thing. Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, what would you say to somebody who argues that they don't have a worldview?
I don't know how I would say it, but the truth is they're just unconscious of it. And it's easy to be unconscious, particularly of secular humanism, and now even more a little bit pantheism. It's easy to be unconscious because everything runs that way. Everything's based on secular humanism. So
wow,
there's not any reason for them to see it individually.
That's profound. So they've assimilated to it so much that they don't even realize they have it.
Right. So that was my struggle, right? As a person coming into Christianity, my struggle was to figure out where this is true and where it's not true,
Yeah.
But most of us, and all the institutions now run that way. Once they got rid of Christianity, for example, in the schools and the universities, and even sort of distorted Christianity itself, once that was gotten rid of in all the schools and everything, they were wide open to believe this, right?
Yeah.
So when I think I say in the book, when Dianne Feinstein was interviewing Amy Barrett for an earlier judgeship, she said to her, "Your dogma speaks loudly in you." She was talking about her Christianity.
Huh.
Like, what I wanted to say was, Dianne, you got a dogma.
Yes.
You got one.
Yeah.
It speaks loudly in the world.
That's actually super helpful, Mary. Thank you. I've never thought of that. I love that reply of, you have one, you're so assimilated to it that you don't know you have it.
Oh, yeah.
So that's, right. And it does make a lot of sense, because one of the arguments that you make in the book, which, we might touch on later, is that secular humanism is just kind of assumed. It's not really argued for.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
So in the book, you focus on 4 specific worldviews. You address material naturalism, secular humanism, pantheism, and Judeo-Christianity. So I want to focus on one of them right now, and that's secular humanism. And you've mentioned a few times here how sometimes you see that worldview can fall into it, so to speak. So you define that as the belief that human beings are alone in the world and must act responsibly by forming their ethics solely from their human experience, human reason, and science. So how, in your view, has secular humanism, in some cases, maybe infiltrated the church at large, or what negative impact has secular humanism had on the church?
I think it's had a huge impact on the church. I think it's because people in the churches have never considered that what we believe kind of commonly is not Christian. And so I think that a lot of churches, and you can tell any church that starts going off, it's probably going off because of secular humanism. A few of them end up adopting a lot of pantheist things, but mostly it's secular humanism. So you go to church and you hear all these nice humanistic terms, right? These nice things. But what those nice things end up leading to is that there's no discernment about the division between the nice looking thing and the true thing. Mm-hmm. For example, it's good to, so you see this a lot with the issues of like sexuality. Like, you should be really good to people, you should be good to all people, listen to all people. And it might just be the way they were made and all these kinds of things. And so pretty soon, then that's no longer a problem. It's just part of human nature, and we should accept it, and we should, honor it. So I think there's a lot of secular humanism going on in churches. Mm-hmm. You can almost walk into a church and, hear a sermon and know whether or not what I'd call little o orthodox it is in terms of Christian belief.
You say one of the big differences between those churches would be that one is God-centered and one is human-centered?
Yes, that's actually a great explanation, just what you said.
you see so many good things like helping the poor and social justice and, but then it seems like it's just, well, whatever the current trend is, a church can easily take that up. Oh, and now we're doing leadership seminars, and now we're doing self-help, and the Enneagram, all kinds of things they just embrace. And it's like,
Right.
when's the last time they were sharing the gospel or talking about evangelism? And it becomes very program driven or topically driven, and everything is to cater to sort of like the felt needs of the congregation. What will draw people, or what will they buy, so to speak? And it becomes like a product. In that sense, maybe that's how I see it playing out. But I don't know what your thoughts would be in that regard.
No, that's a really good explanation of it. I mean, it's just humanism, it sounds good, but it's not Christian. I mean, I go back again to what Jesus said. He wasn't a feel good guy.
Yeah.
He would have been kind of hard to know.
Yeah. So in going back to that point that I touched on a little bit ago, one of the points that stick out for me a lot in the book is this idea that secular humanism, it's just assumed. It's not even if we have to argue for the truth of it. How do we combat that?
It'll be difficult to combat. When you started the question, the thing that flashed into my mind is how many counselors who are actually Christian, who are really just counseling in terms of secular humanism. Yeah. I mean, the only way to counter it is to really, I think we've got to go back to the Bible and the churches, and we've got to really talk about discernment. And there's a way to accept people without accepting what they do, right?
Yes.
And that's not something we're very practiced at. What we often tend to do is to go over to their side instead of trying to clearly say the difference, clearly describe differences. I think the only thing that's going to work is for more people to go to churches that are teaching the gospel.
Mm.
Yeah.
Well, you also address in there, one of the worldviews that you go in depth talking about in the book is material naturalism. And you define that as a belief that all that exists is in the world is ultimately reducible to material phenomenon. And of course, this is a very prevalent belief, especially those among the skeptical community.
Right.
I was wondering, one of the things that you do so beautifully in the book, I think, is that you implicitly argue kind of for the beauty of Christianity and how it encompasses all of these true principles, the truth of the world. Mm-hmm. But what are some consequences of looking at the world through solely material naturalism view? Well,
first of all, I'd say there are very few people who really do that. And they're usually in the sciences. Mm-hmm. And the loudest atheists are generally materialist. They don't want there to be anything that exists that we can't control. Of course, when you really start talking about the spiritual truths of human nature and the spiritual truths of the universe, then as human beings, we always want to control it, right? So we want to take control of all that. But I really don't think there's that many people who ultimately are materialist. There are some Christians that tend to be like that, but so you would think that, for example, let's say I've got a problem and I need a counselor, and that counselor might just sort of attribute my problem to something that happened to me that was sort of materialist, but that's not what's really going on, because what's going on is how I deal with it in my own self, right? But I really don't think there's that many materialists. I think most materialists are also secular humanists, and they just tend to lean that way. A lot of scientists do that because they have this scientific method that doesn't have a category, or doesn't have a methodology for looking beyond material.
I wonder too if many people who would claim to be a material naturalist would be that way in word, but in their real life, you almost can't live that out consistently.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there's anybody who lives that way.
Yeah, I mean, most people behave as if we're more than just material phenomenon. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, what I'm kind of seeing is this idea that maybe within Christianity, one can say, oh, well, I hold to the Christian worldview, as if being a Christian suddenly means that now I'm over here in this category, when that's not really the case. You don't get just plopped into that category of thinking. Maybe you're been transferred from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light, but your thinking can still be completely secular, or you can be influenced by Western pantheism, or all of these different sorts of non-Christian worldviews. You're still thinking in the world's molds, as it were. So I think maybe that would be a point to think about when we're looking at worldviews. It's not just a matter of, oh, let's confront pantheism and where it's incorrect. I take it as, where do we see this thinking within the church, and how do we need to combat it? That sort of thing. Am I on the right track there?
I think you are. I mean, I think that's the real issue, is discerning.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what I'd say. Discernment is really what you're pointing out, how important it is.
Well, let's talk a little bit about pantheism, because we're trying to maybe cover the bases a little bit within what you cover in the book, to give everybody a taster, and then we'll just point them to the book. Earlier, we mentioned what we would say Western pantheism, this idea that one could be, for instance, oh, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. So can you talk about what you see happening within the church in that regard, and the dangers of that, or how we might combat that? What your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, I think this is probably a huge issue. I don't know how deeply it's affected the church, but I think a lot of people who don't go to church and wouldn't go to church, maybe even, call themselves spiritual. Everybody wants to call themselves spiritual because supposedly the definition of spiritual is good, right? That you're working on your goodness.
Oh, right.
So that's what they want to do, I think. But the way that we do it in the United States, and probably in most places, unless you're like in India, where Hinduism is really dominant, most of us, we want to say we have a spirituality because that means goodness. And so we toy with the pantheist thing because it's spiritual, and we don't discern what spiritual means. And that's a real problem, because the darkest evil is very spiritual, extremely spiritual. And we just don't know how to discern, I think. And I do think that this is very, very dominant because of the people who are running the big corporations that we all use. We all use Amazon. We all use Google. We all use these things. We all use, well, I don't, but most everybody uses Facebook. So, all those people have this sort of spiritual and not religious idea about the world and about themselves, especially about themselves.
So one of the things I hinted at earlier, Mary, is in regard to Christianity. You say this in the book, and just to give listeners kind of a taste of the book, what Mary essentially does is she looks at these four worldviews: material naturalism, secular humanism, pantheism, and then, of course, the Judeo-Christian worldview. And she looks at different aspects of life. And Mary, you can tell me if this isn't the best kind of mini review. She looks at different aspects of life that we all experience. And basically, the book accumulates to showing that there are parts of that experience that material naturalism, secular humanism, and pantheism touch on, but only Christianity kind of encompasses all the true and reasonable principles that come out of those other three, or are manifest in those other three.
Right.
Is that accurate?
That's right.
You make this statement: Christ's teachings unify the spiritual, the natural, and human worlds. I know that's a huge statement, but can you unpack that a little bit for us? Again, it was Christ's teachings unify the spiritual, natural, and human worlds.
Well, I just think that it's very hard to call Christ. I mean, he's not a materialist, and yet he knows about the material world, right? He knows about clouds and rain, and he uses those as examples in his teaching. He knows about humanism in the sense that he knows a better way for humans to relate. I mean, he's always doing things that a secular humanist would love, right? Mm-hmm. He's healing the sick and, taking care of widows and things like that, or talking about taking care of widows. So I think that there's really a lot in Christianity that overlaps with secular humanism, but the secular humanists go off in terms of not being able to clearly define a particular characteristic so that it's Christian as opposed to just secular humanist or just materialist. And I think it is very difficult to do that. You know, almost any philosophy you take, or let's say any kind of psychology, like existentialism. I mean, there's something in existentialism that Christians would believe, right?
Sure.
Right? But not the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And the same is true in things like cultural or gender studies. I mean, Christianity knows there's a difference between male and female, right? Even better than we do, better than the rest of us do. Or behaviorism, you know, that people are governed by the behaviors that other people exhibit when they do what they do. So all of those things have some little corner of Christianity, but they always go too far. They go too far outside of the truth and turn something into a full-blown psychology. One of the best people, I think, who does this, who really explains this, is Paul Betts, again, who's still in Washington, D.C. I believe he's a convert. He became Catholic, but he does a lot in psychology in terms of being able to explain the secular psychology and then explain Christian psychology. What would Christian psychology look like? I learned a lot from him and still do, actually, but it's discernment, I guess, is the issue here. Being able to discern when you've gotten off track. And to look at Jesus' life is the best way to discern that, right?
Yeah.
Or to stay in the Bible. Like, I realized, I guess, about December that I was no longer reading my one-year Bible anymore. So now I'm back on it. Because if I'm not in it, I'm not thinking about it as much every day. But if I'm really reading it, there's just so much in the Bible that shows you the wrongness in human nature and the rightness of Jesus.
Yes. We want to point people to your book, so we'll do that in the show notes with a link to where they can find that there. But before we bring the interview to a close, I wonder if, you mentioned your other book and the time you spent in Calcutta. Your other book is Finding Calcutta. As we bring the interview to a close, I wonder if you would mind maybe just sharing from your experience. You mentioned the time you spent there with Mother Teresa. Could I ask you what you think might have impacted you most about your time?
Oh, that's a good question. I think the biggest impact was to see a group of women who didn't live in the world. I mean, they didn't even live like I live in the world now. They were so unworldly. Their faces, I don't know how to say this, they just seemed very pure. Now, there's very few people who can live like that. And, the Bible's full of the notion that those of us who are in the world, even them, also have sin, right? And we can also be forgiven. So I think that was one of the major things that hit me about the Missionaries of Charity was their strong commitment. And one of the ways they maintained that commitment is they had some rules that were pretty strict. Like, this one would help in teachers' lounges. You were not allowed to speak during the day unless what you were going to say was necessary to get the work done.
Wow.
So it was a very quiet place as a consequence, because you just didn't hear them. They never chatted. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we chatting, I think, too, as a humanistic, we use it to get to know each other and things like that. But they were not interested in knowing us or knowing each other. Really, they just didn't do it. It was a completely different atmosphere. So I worked with sick and handicapped children from infant to 12-year-olds, and I've worked with handicapped children before, and there's usually quite a good deal of chaos about it. But not there. It wasn't only quiet because the kids who were, especially the kids who were ambulatory, would make up little games and run around the room and chase each other and things like that. And that was all fun. You know, they laughed, and they were not required to be silent, but it was a very different atmosphere. So when you walked in, you knew you had walked into a place that was different. I guess that's the best way to describe it. And there was a time when every day when the volunteers were allowed to take a break with each other. So we would take a break and get a cup of tea or whatever. And as soon as we would do that, people would sort of argue about something that had happened, or, you know, Mother Teresa really should do this and they should not do this and all of that. And you could just see how that kind of daily talk wrecks the work. Because if you're angry about something like that, when you get around, and there was a woman who, you know, was kind of like that. And she was a volunteer from the United States. And when she would try to help the little, especially the bedridden children, they would often cry. I mean, it's like, but they didn't with other people. So there was just a way there that is not the way anywhere else. And I don't mean that we have to all be silent or anything, but there is a lot of stuff that goes on amongst us that doesn't need to go on. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah.
Especially criticism.
What was Mother Teresa like?
Well, Mother Teresa probably said 6 things to me in the whole time I was there. She was very quiet. She didn't speak much. She spoke very little. She worked hard. If there was a piece of paper on the floor, she would pick it up. And I was there about a year and a month before she passed away. So I was really fortunate. But she wasn't that well. And she refused to, all these doctors would come from the West and say, you know, let us give you heart surgery or whatever, you know, and she just wouldn't do it. She basically told me one day that I didn't know who I was.
Wow.
And, you know, that I didn't know yet who I was. And I'm trying to think how she said it, because it didn't like blow me away or anything, but I knew she was right. She had an amazing perception. During the time I was there, Christopher Hitchens was writing his horrible books about her, and one of them came out. His worst book about her, which was all about her, came out, and you know, people had it in Calcutta, and at the same time, every morning, because we already knew somehow we already knew he was getting sick, but that they had a prayer board. And his name was on the prayer board to pray for every morning.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
While he was publishing this book about her, she had this other way of being. It was amazing. I mean,
don't you say in the book something along the lines of, if my memory serves me correct, that she was asked about the book and she simply kind of said, I've forgiven him. And he was very offended by that.
Yes, he was. He said he didn't need to be forgiven.
Yes. Yeah, he didn't need to be forgiven. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
that sounds about right.
Yeah, he was the character. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for everything you shared today. And again, we'll point our listeners to your book. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address, or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice. And please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.